Well, here it is, one of the biggest challenges you will ever face when it comes to communication, and that is this question: how do you talk to a narcissist? If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused, drained, frustrated, or even questioning yourself, there's a good chance you've encountered this dynamic before. And maybe you didn't have a name for it at the time. Maybe you just knew that something felt off. You knew no matter what you said, it was twisted. You knew no matter how calm or reasonable you tried to be, the conversation never went anywhere. And you knew that somehow you ended up feeling like the bad guy. Welcome to the Jefferson Fisher podcast. I'm on a mission to help make your next conversation the one that changes everything. And if you enjoy learning practical tools that help you protect your peace, regulate your emotions, and communicate with confidence, I'm going to ask you to follow this podcast and leave a review. If you have questions or topic ideas, throw them in the comments. I genuinely read them, and many of these episodes are inspired by the situations you're dealing with right now. Now, here's the thing about narcissistic behavior. On the outside, they often look completely normal. They might be charming. They might be funny. They might even seem confident and successful. Maybe you're related to one. Maybe you work with one. Maybe you're co-parenting with one. But a narcissistic pattern usually reveals itself very quickly once the conversation starts. And not because of what you say, but because of how they respond. Let me define this very simply, because the word narcissist gets thrown around a lot. I'm not talking clinically here. I'm not diagnosing anyone. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not sitting in a position where I can label someone with a medical condition. That matters because the word gets misused all the time. Someone disagrees with us, hurts our feelings, or doesn't understand us, and suddenly they get labeled a narcissist. That's not what we're doing here. What we're talking about is narcissistic behavior. And at its core, it is someone who cannot imagine thinking about someone else. They cannot put themselves in another person's shoes. Their experience is always the center of the universe. It's always about how they feel, how they look, how they're perceived. If someone else is having a good time, they need to be having a better time. If someone else is frustrated, they need you to be more frustrated. It's not empathy driving them, it's gratification. And when they don't get it, they escalate. They are often the perpetual victim. Nothing is ever truly their fault. Accountability feels threatening. Admitting wrong feels like losing control. And here's the part that surprises people. They often have no problem telling you exactly who they are. They'll say things like, "I'm just blunt," or "I tell it like it is," or "That's just how I am. Pay attention to that." That's not self-awareness. That's a warning label. So what do? How do you communicate when logic fails, empathy is absent, and every conversation feels like a trap? The first thing you need to understand is that when you're talking to someone like this, you are stepping into a game, and it's a game you cannot win. I call it praise or provoke. If they feel praised, if they feel admired, if they feel validated, the conversation stays calm. If they don't, they will provoke, they will criticize, they will insult, they will accuse, not because they want resolution, but because they want control. Your frustration is just as satisfying to them as your praise. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever tried calmly explaining yourself only for the conversation to suddenly turn into an argument? That wasn't accidental. Have you ever felt like they were pushing your buttons on purpose? They were. Have you ever walked away thinking, why did they say that right then? Because they wanted a reaction. This is why the game is rigged. You go into it thinking, if I just explain myself better, they'll understand. They won't. You think, if I can show them how unfair this is, they'll see it. They won't. The moment you step into the game, they're already winning because the prize for them is control. So the first rule is simple: don't play. That doesn't mean you disappear. It doesn't mean you roll over. It means you recognize what's happening and take your pieces off the board. You stop trying to win a game that was never designed for fairness. The second rule might feel counterintuitive, especially if you're someone who values communication and clarity. And it's this often: the best move you can make is no move at all. Silence is incredibly powerful when used correctly. Silence cannot be misquoted. It cannot be twisted. It cannot be replayed and manipulated. When you speak a lot, especially when your emotional, narcissistic behavior thrives, they will take a sentence, isolate a word, remove it from context, and suddenly you're the villain. Suddenly they're the victim. Suddenly you're defending yourself again. Notice the pattern. You explain something logically and reasonably. They latch on a one phrase. They ignore everything else. They twist it. Then they attack that twisted version. And now you're stuck reacting to something you never meant. Silence breaks that loop. Now, let me be very clear. Silence does not mean stonewalling. It does not mean passive aggression. It means choosing not to feed the cycle. If you do speak, neutrality becomes your strongest asset. Neutral phrases like, "Okay, noted, I hear you, thank you for saying that," may feel weak at first. They're not. They're strategic. They give nothing to grab onto. They don't escalate. They don't provoke. They don't defend. They simply exist. And that's uncomfortable for someone who thrives on reaction. You might feel the urge to say more. You'll want to clarify. You'll want to fix the misunderstanding. Resist that urge. The more you talk, the more material they have, the fewer words you use, the safer you are. Which brings me to the third mindset shift: stop expecting them to understand you. This is the hardest one. There is a deep human desire to be understood. When someone listens, empathizes, and reflects your experience back to you, it feels validating. But with narcissistic behavior, that expectation becomes a trap. You start thinking, if I can just say it the right way, something will click. It won't. They cannot step into your perspective the way you want them to. And that's not a moral failure. It's a limitation. So stop digging the hole and expecting them to fill it. Instead, redirect that energy inward. Ask yourself, what do I need right now to stay grounded? Where does my strength actually come from? Because it doesn't come from their apology. It doesn't come from their acknowledgement. And it certainly doesn't come from them suddenly changing. There are givers and takers in relationships. Narcissistic behavior takes. It drains. It consumes. That means you must be intentional about where you refill. Friends who listen, people who see you, spaces where you don't have to perform or defend. And understand this deeply. You do not need an apology to validate your feelings. You don't need closure from someone who lacks accountability. Sometimes closure is simply putting the shovel down and walking away. Now let me share something practical, because theory only helps so much without application. One of my favorite parts of this podcast is answer listener questions, and I get many through my weekly newsletter. This one comes from Marianne in North Carolina. She's a single mother of two. Divorced, her ex-husband is diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and communication feels impossible. Nothing she does seems to help. Everything makes it worse. Marianne, first of all, I'm really sorry you're dealing with that. And the fact that you're asking this question tells me everything I need to know about the kind of parent you are. Now, here's what I've seen work in high conflict situations, especially where reputation matters. Narcissistic behavior is deeply attached to image. They care intensely about how they're perceived. That's leverage not to manipulate, but to protect yourself. If someone makes a veiled threat, an insinuation, or tries to instigate, a simple phrase like, "If you think that's a good look for you," can be incredibly effective. You're not accusing. You're not escalating. You're simply reminding them that the world exists outside this conversation. Another phrase is, "And you think that's okay." Again, you're not attacking. You're prompting self-reflection without handing over emotional energy. Text communication can also be safer than phone calls. Why? Because you have a record. Gaslighting thrives without accountability. Text creates clarity, and keep your text short, one sentence max. The longer your message, the more ammunition you provide. They will ignore the substance and respond to a single word they can twist. Short, calm, neutral. If there's a contradiction, point it out plainly. This contradicts what you said on March 3rd. Period. No commentary, no emotion. And finally, neutrality. Gray rock, minimal reaction, consistency. This approach isn't about winning. It's about protecting your nervous system. And I want to leave you with this thought. The strongest communicators are not the loudest. They're not the most articulate. They're the most grounded. When you stop defending yourself, you stop giving away your power. When you stop explaining, you stop performing. When you stop chasing understanding, you start leading your own energy. And that, more than any argument you could ever win, is what actually changes everything. If you found this helpful, please follow the podcast and leave a review wherever you listen. It genuinely helps more people find these tools. And remember, clarity over chaos, boundaries over defense, and calm over control. Your peace is worth protecting.